I was standing in the shadow of the Florence Cathedral recently, watching tourists gaze up at that massive terracotta dome.
Oh, it's an incredible sight.
It is. The atmosphere was, almost religious people whispering, pointing at the marble, just totally captivated by what they believed was the ultimate expression of human genius and spiritual devotion. And it's easy to get swept up in it, to see the Renaissance as this pure golden age of art. But then I noticed something small etched into the stonework, a specific coat of arms. And suddenly the whole romantic image it collapsed. I realized I wasn't looking at a church, I was looking at a receipt.
A receipt, that's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah. The guide nearby was talking about beauty and light, but the real story, hidden in plain sight, was about something much darker. It wasn't about faith, it was about a specific family that figured out how to monetize sin itself. They were the ones who realized that if you handle the Pope's money, you don't need to listen to the Pope. You own him. That magnificent dome above us, it wasn't built to honor God. It was a massive stone billboard designed to launder the reputation of a bank.
It creates a real disconnect.
A jarring one. You have these breathtaking masterpieces that define Western culture, yet they were funded by a system of bribery, extortion, and, well, the invention of modern oligarchy. It forces you to ask a very uncomfortable question. When we look at the great men of history, are we seeing their actual legacy, or are we just staring at the propaganda they paid for?
That uncomfortable question, the one that sits right between the genius of the Renaissance and the cold calculation of the balance sheet, is precisely what we're going to try to resolve today. The Medici family didn't just, passively accumulate riches. They systematically engineered a new system of power. They converted pure raw finance into political control and, maybe most powerfully, into cultural legitimacy.
So our mission for this deep dive is to analyze the blueprint they created.
Exactly. It's a timeless model for how a financial elite can rule over generations, even while maintaining the illusion of a functioning democratic framework.
I think the biggest challenge in studying the Medici is separating the art from the operation. You claim the dome was propaganda, but surely some of that funding came from genuine piety. I mean, how do we separate the bank from the believer in the historical record?
Well, it's never a clean break. But history shows us that the pious acts were always strategic. We see the ledger entries detailing the political costs and benefits. So before we can even look at the art, we have to understand the machine that generated the capital in the first place.
Okay, let's start there. Let's unpack the foundation of their power. The invention of the financial empire. What was the world like when the Medici Bank first appeared? Because this wasn't just a regular business. It was a response to a massive historical upheaval.
It absolutely was. You have to set the stage. In the late 14th century, Europe was a profoundly broken place. The Black Death had ripped through the continent, killing maybe a third of the population?
Unimaginable.
And this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a fundamental economic shock that completely shattered the feudal system. The old power structure based on owning land, the knights, the lords, the inherited titles, it all suddenly became brittle.
Why? Because land requires labor, and labor was suddenly scarce and expensive?
Exactly. Power shifted decisively away from the country estate to where the people and capital were concentrated.
Yeah.
In the cities. And trade hubs like Florence, with its booming wool and textile industries, were at the center of it all.
This created the perfect turbulent environment for an ambitious innovator.
Right. Enter Giovanni de' Medici. He founded the Medici Bank in 1397, and his key revolutionary insight was recognizing that in this new world, money moved faster, was more liquid, and was far more influential than static land or, slow-moving armies. Finance became the new foundation for state-making.
And what made the Medici Bank different from the hundreds of other small lenders in Italy? Because it quickly grew beyond just a local Florentine operation.
That was the crucial difference. The Medici Bank wasn't a local lender lending to local people. It was a massive, sophisticated, cross-border financial network, a true multinational corporation in an era where international travel was dangerous and rare.
So they deliberately set up branches across Europe.
All the key centers: Venice, Rome, Geneva, Bruges, London.
That sounds like an incredible logistical undertaking for the time. How did they manage to link up these distant cities so effectively?
They leveraged financial innovation, specifically the bill of exchange. Remember, in the 15th century, moving actual gold coin across Europe was incredibly risky. You had highway robberies, shipwrecks, seizures.
Of course.
The bill of exchange allowed a merchant in Florence to deposit money and receive a piece of paper that could be redeemed for local currency in, say, Bruges or London. It essentially created a transfer of credit, which solved two huge problems at once.
Okay, what were those two problems?
First, risk management. Money was moving invisibly and safely across borders. Second, it provided a very clever way to skirt the church's strict rules against usury charging interest on loans, which was considered a mortal sin.
Ah, I see. So by framing it as a foreign exchange transfer, not a loan, they could hide the interest they were charging.
They became masters of the financial loophole. They could monetize capital flow while maintaining an appearance of piety. That is a foundational piece of their empire.
In this network, it created a new kind of power structure.
It did. It allowed the Medici family and their agents, the professional managers running these branches, to become central to what we now call the circulation of elites. Power was no longer purely held by inherited title or feudal land. It was driven by financial expertise, network control, and credit management.
So if you were a noble financing a war, a merchant shipping silk, or a pope collecting revenue, you needed the Medici.
You needed them. And speaking of the Pope, here's where the power really accelerates. The ultimate golden goose controlling the papacy's ledger.
This was the critical factor.
Precisely. The thing that elevated them beyond just wealthy merchants was securing the contract as the bankers of the church. This meant handling every single aspect of papal finances, including tithes collected across Europe, all church revenue, and most famously, the massive streams of income generated by the sale of indulgences.
I never fully realized until looking at this that by managing the revenue of salvation itself, the Medici literally profited from sin and salvation simultaneously.
It's the ultimate paradox, isn't it? The church was selling forgiveness, and the Medici were counting and managing the cash flow. This gave them not just immense wealth, but crucial tactical influence over the most powerful religious and temporal institution in Europe.
If the Pope needed funds transferred immediately to a political ally or an army, he needed them.
He was completely dependent on their network. And this leads us to the surprising, fascinating example of the alum monopoly, which connects all the dots between piety, trade, and geopolitical leverage.
Okay, so the story of alum. For context, what was alum?
Alum was absolutely essential for the European textile industry. It was the chemical needed to set dyeing cloth. Without alum, there's no vibrant red or blue on your silk or wool. It's a core economic bottleneck.
So a critical resource. How did the Medici corner the market on it?
Well, in the mid-15th century, massive deposits of alum were discovered near Tulfa, which was controlled by the papacy. The Pope needed funds, maybe to fight the Ottomans, a common need at the time. The Medici, already managing the papal accounts, strategically secured a monopoly over the sales and distribution of the Tulfa alum mines.
They financed the papacy in exchange for control of this resource.
Exactly. So now, the Florentine banker, acting as the papacy's agent, controls a resource essential to the entire European textile economy.
What does that mean in practical terms for their power structure?
It means that a local Medici agent, a young, sharp man managing the Rome branch, suddenly holds immense quiet power. Let's trace the supply chain to see the political impact. If the Pope is relying on revenue from alum sales to fund his war chest, and the Medici control the distribution and pricing of that alum to the dying cities of Europe,
they can manipulate the whole system.
A whole system. They could potentially freeze the flow of funds to a crusade or bankrupt rival kingdoms like Naples or Venice simply by tightening or cutting credit access to alum.
So the key political power wasn't held by the cardinal standing next to the Pope, but by the dusty courier arriving with the bills of exchange.
Precisely. The traditional hierarchy, where power flowed from kings and bishops, was subverted entirely by the flow of money. It highlights the formation of a new class of people, the cross-border agents of capital.
The first version of what we now call the transnational managerial class.
That's right. People who control the plumbing of the global economy outside of any single country's jurisdiction.
So that foundational financial machine, the speed, the reach, the control over the church's purse strings, is what Giovanni built. But pure finance, as we know, can be fragile. His son, Cosimo the Elder, arrived to turn that financial dominance into undeniable political acquisition in Florence itself.
That's the necessary next step. Cosimo de' Medici inherited this massive bank, and he instantly understood that the empire could not survive if he didn't secure his home base. He recognized the threat of local political rivals who might seize his assets or exile him.
But Florence was a republic, at least in name, with elected officials. How do you take over a republic without an army?
You don't seize power, you buy it. You bind it through obligation. Cosimo pursued a strategy of soft acquisition, strategically spreading Medici wealth not through outright gifts, but through loans to allies, gifts to churches, and even bribes to rivals.
He cultivated a massive network.
A huge one. He expanded his influential circle to include 27 households and countless political supporters. He essentially treated them as honorary extensions of the Medici business.
This moves beyond simple bribery, though. It sounds like he was building a vast, interconnected shadow government.
He was. Cosimo consolidated his family and party, creating a political structure that mirrored the hierarchical structure of his own bank. And he ruled indirectly. He never held the title of prince or duke. He just manipulated the government, the Signoria, from behind the scenes.
We should probably define the Signoria for people, since that was the true center of Florentine government.
Absolutely. The Signoria was the sovereign governing council of the Republic, made up of 9 elected officials called the Priori. These were the men who made the crucial policy decisions.
And theoretically, they were chosen randomly.
Theoretically, through a complex system where names were placed into a leather bag called the bussola. Every few months, names were drawn out. It was designed to prevent any one faction from gaining permanent control.
But the reality was far from random because Cosimo controlled the eligibility list.
Exactly. Cosimo's instruments were bonds of obligation, not legal force. If a politician, a guild, or a powerful merchant owed the Medici, they had to vote for Medici projects. And critically, through a system of orchestrated reforms, they made sure that the names placed into the bussola, the list of those eligible for office, contained only the names of his friends and allies.
So the democracy becomes mere theater performance. The script is written entirely by the creditor.
This is the chilling demonstration of the iron law of oligarchy, that in any organization, power inevitably concentrates in the hands of the few who control the resources, regardless of the stated democratic rules.
And Cosimo's genius was making that oligarchy appear benevolent and democratic. Let's delve into the psychological power of that debt, because that feels like the key insight. The sources detail the story of Luca the wool merchant, and I think that anecdote perfectly captures the suffocating weight of gratitude.
That account is fascinating because it shows how Cosimo created this informal chain of control. So imagine Luca, a proud mid-level wool merchant in Florence in the 1430s. He's a staunch Republican. He believes in civic liberty and the Signoria.
And he's doing okay for himself.
He's financially sound until one bad winter, a shipment is lost, perhaps a large client defaults. Ruin is imminent. He can't turn to a public lender because the church strictly polices usury.
And if he goes bankrupt, he loses his civic rights, his family's reputation, everything he's built.
Precisely. Then, quietly, a representative from the Medici palace visits. He doesn't offer a high-interest loan that breaks the church's laws. Instead, he offers assistance, a low-interest, non-usurious arrangement, often described as a debt of honor, to cover the immediate shortfall.
Handshake deal.
A handshake, a simple entry in the bank ledger, and Luca is saved from disgrace. The debt is not just financial, it's personal. It's gratitude for salvation.
It creates an invisible chain.
It does. So the next time the bussola is brought out to pick the council, Luca is informed, not with a threat, but with a gentle suggestion, that a vote for a pro-Medici candidate would be wise or beneficial for the city.
And he looks around the piazza and sees the same look in everyone's eyes.
He realizes the baker, the armorer, the silk weaver, all those who were struggling a few months ago, they all got the same quiet visit. The Republic still stands, the elections happen, but the outcome was finalized in a back room by the counting house weeks ago.
They didn't need to abolish the elections because they controlled the eligibility and the motivation of every voter. The ultimate subversion is when the citizens willingly participate in the system that restricts their freedom.
And Cosimo achieved this through his incredible skill in business and politics, leveraging these financial bonds into total control over the city.
The true test of this power came in 1433 when his political rivals, the Albizzi family, finally succeeded in exiling him. They thought they had won.
A disastrous miscalculation. They only controlled the local government and the city walls. They failed to grasp the transnational nature of the Medici Bank. Cosimo was exiled for a year of a 10-year sentence, but he was not financially broken.
He just moved his operation.
He retreated to Venice, and as he noted, his enemies thought to ruin us, but he lost no credit. In fact, foreign merchants and gentlemen offered him, and even sent to Venice, large sums of money.
He was financially independent of the state he was supposedly exiled from. He essentially used his global network to hold the city hostage.
He did. The city found itself economically crippled without the flow of Medici credit. His allies still held key financial levers, and his business partners simply continued operating through the international branches.
So he was treated like a head of state in exile.
Almost, yes. Within a year, the economic and political pressure became unbearable for the Albizzi, and Florence was forced to recall Cosimo in 1434.
And upon his return, his grip on power solidified completely. The sources say he was the final word on Florence's foreign policy, even without an official title.
He was the informal ruler. No important decision was reached without consulting the Medici palace. Ambassadors invariably called upon Cosimo before taking up their appointments. He wielded this immense informal influence, which extended even to the papacy.
So he made Florence a republic in name, but a Medici business in reality.
In every way that mattered.
So we look at this historical blueprint using debt and financial leverage to control politics, and we see its structural echo today. This is the contemporary resonance we need to get into now.
Absolutely. If we investigate how contemporary global financial elites strategically leverage vast economic wealth, we see the Medici blueprint in action. These elites don't necessarily sit in government offices, but they fund the systems that choose who sits there.
We're talking about the influence of campaign financing and a massive lobbying efforts on policy.
Precisely. When global financiers fund primary elections or hold the debt of nations or even massive municipal debts, voters might be participating in a democratic exercise, but the ultimate policy outcomes are often predetermined by the bank ledgers.
Right. Modern tactics mirroring this control would be corporations using lobbying, campaign financing, and the strategic distribution of bailouts or development funds to shape public policy.
Yes. If the government is reliant on a certain corporation for its infrastructure investment, or if the political parties are entirely funded by a handful of donors, the voter is still voting, but the range of acceptable policies is incredibly narrow.
So it creates a system where the accumulation of wealth becomes essential to
the political system itself. It reinforces the iron law of oligarchy in the 21st century. The few who control the resources will always exert disproportionate political influence, regardless of the democratic framework overlay. They operate outside the spirit of democracy.
Which brings us perfectly to the next step of the blueprint. If sections 1 and 2 were about building and controlling the political machine, section 3 is where they transform that raw, often unpopular power into something immortal, cultural legitimacy. This is propaganda as immortality.
Cosimo understood something profound. Raw wealth breeds massive envy and resentment. Florence was a city of fiery preachers who constantly condemned usury and the vanity of the rich.
But wealth converted into culture, into beauty, and piety breeds loyalty.
It does. It was a conscious effort to create a positive public image. It was an investment. By 1472, the family had spent over 600,000 florins for public purposes since Cosimo's return. That's an astronomical amount of money.
An investment in image laundering on a massive scale. They portrayed the family not as ruthless bankers, but as pious, wise, and benevolent benefactors of Florence.
And the physical monuments were the stone billboards you mentioned in the intro.
The most prominent example, of course, is Brunelleschi's dome for the Florence Cathedral.
It's one of the greatest architectural feats in history. Cosimo funded its completion. The dome became the symbol of Florence's unparalleled greatness, its ingenuity, and its divine blessing.
And by extension, the greatness and beneficence of the Medici who paid for it. The receipt is written in stone.
Absolutely. The dome dominates the skyline. Every citizen sees it every day. It's a constant subconscious reminder of who elevated the city. But the patronage went further. Cosimo funded the reconstruction of San Marco, including the creation of the first public library.
A gesture reinforcing his image as a learned, pious citizen.
Right, promoting the city's spiritual and intellectual welfare. He was very careful to balance these public works with private statements of power, too.
Like his own residence, the Palazzo Medici.
Indeed. It wasn't just a house, it was a clear physical image of his growing authority. The papal secretary at the time said that in all of Rome, the seat of the church, no private building displayed greater magnificence than Cosimo's Florentine residence. That sent an unmistakable message.
But the most direct, subtle weapon was the art commissioned inside these structures, what you called the golden cage of patronage. Let's talk about Botticelli's adoration of the Magi.
This is a masterclass in soft power and reputation management. Imagine being that citizen we discussed earlier, maybe resentful of the Medici's wealth, maybe listening to sermons condemning greed. You walk into the church of Santa Maria Novella and you see this breathtaking altarpiece.
Visually stunning, holy, comforting, but the faces are disturbingly familiar.
You look closer at the figures kneeling before the Christ child. The three kings and their entourage are direct, recognizable portraits of the Medici family, including Cosimo the Elder himself, kneeling humbly as one of the Magi.
They have literally painted themselves into the biblical narrative.
Yes. And in the Medici Palace Chapel, another fresco of the scene places the entire family and their political allies in the retinue of the philosopher kings.
That is profound. They are associating the Medici not with usury in the bank ledger, but with divine benevolence, the journey of wise men and the glory of culture.
The effect is psychological warfare. Your justifiable anger at their wealth dissipates, replaced by awe and a subtle political acceptance. The Medici become inseparable from the culture and beauty they sponsor.
To oppose the Medici would be to oppose culture, spirituality, and beauty itself.
You've bought into their perception of reality. And this cultural image management extends even to the appropriation of Republican ideals, neutralizing potential threats from pro-democracy factions.
This is the crucial layer.
It is. Cosimo also commissioned works that spoke directly to the highest ideals of the Republic, like Donatello's revolutionary bronze David. The statue, it likely sat in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici.
The image of David, the small boy triumphing over the mighty Goliath, was the perfect symbol for Florence as a small republic constantly battling larger, stronger rivals.
Exactly. It symbolized civic virtue and the defense of liberty. By housing David and an accompanying inscription linking brave fighting for the homeland to divine aid, the Medici linked their own authority and survival directly to the city's highest civic ideals.
They were telling the Florentines, "We are the champions of your liberty, therefore our exclusive control is justified."
They masked their manipulation by claiming the mantle of virtue.
This reveals a structural functionalist role for this kind of spending. It's not just about ego, it's about control. And that begs the contemporary parallel. Are we seeing this structural function today in modern philanthropy?
We are. Modern philanthropic foundations, cultural endowments, and effective altruism initiatives perform a remarkably similar function as sophisticated instruments of elite soft power and image management.
Help us distinguish between genuine charity and strategic image laundering, though.
The distinction lies in the outcome and the visibility. While much of this giving does immense good funding scientific research, libraries, hospitals, the structural function for the giver is often to sanitize the image of hyperwealth. It makes the accumulation of vast, often historically unprecedented fortunes seem palatable, even necessary for the public good.
So the foundation becomes the means of converting wealth accumulated through potentially controversial business practices into positive social capital.
Precisely. Elite philanthropy is often a vehicle for converting surplus funds into prized alternative forms of capital, enhanced reputation, political capital, soft power, rather than being a pure, simple act of altruism.
The Medici used art to sanitize their usury.
And today's massive cultural endowments soften the image of hyper-capitalism and allow the elite to shape the cultural and academic landscape, subtly influencing public policy agendas beyond overt political lobbying. It's a way of saying, you need us, the wealthy, because without us, this beauty, this research, this culture would disappear.
That analysis makes every museum wing and every named university hall feel a lot heavier. Now, let's move to the ultimate expansion of this power. How Cosimo's successful blueprint allowed the next generation, especially Lorenzo the Magnificent, to solidify the dynasty and eventually embed themselves in the papacy itself.
Cosimo's foundation was so secure that his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, could transition from a shrewd banker to a cultural prince. Lorenzo was a true polymath, a diplomat, a poet, and the primary patron of the Renaissance, supporting giants like Botticelli and Michelangelo.
He amplified the cultural legitimacy Cosimo built.
He did, making Florence the undisputed epicenter of European thought and art. He essentially became a monarch without a crown.
Though Florence was still technically a republic.
Technically. Lorenzo was treated as its de facto ruler. He continued the strategy of ensuring his allies filled all government posts. But beneath the veneer of poetry and patronage lay ruthless political calculation, perfectly illustrated by the Pazzi conspiracy in 1478.
That was the assassination attempt orchestrated by a rival family with papal backing.
It showed the violent realities of Medici rule. The Pazzi family, aided by an archbishop and potentially Pope Sixtus V, tried to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during High Mass in the Florence Cathedral.
Giuliano was killed, Lorenzo was wounded but escaped.
In his immediate and brutal response, hunting down the conspirators, hanging the archbishop in his vestments from the palazzo window, demonstrated that the family's power was backed by terrifying force, not just fine art. He survived that trial by blood and emerged stronger, unifying the city behind the Medici name.
It's astonishing that this family, after decades of financial maneuvering, finally put their own blood on the throne of St. Peter.
The ultimate subversion. They weren't satisfied being bankers to the Pope. They achieved political mutation by producing two popes, Leo X and Clement VII.
Banking literally turned into the papacy.
When Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, he was famously quoted as saying, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." He treated the Vatican like an extension of the Medici estate, focusing on lavish patronage and political maneuvering to bankroll Medici interest across Italy.
And this is where the financial blueprint Cosimo started, ironically, begins to fracture the very institution they controlled.
Yes, the long-term unintended consequence of their financial ambition. Pope Leo X needed massive funds for his projects, patronage, festivals, the costly reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica. So he aggressively leveraged the very revenue source the Medici Bank had once managed, the sale of indulgences.
The idea that salvation could be purchased, the monetization of sin and forgiveness, was pushed to its absolute limit under the Medici Pope.
Precisely. The papal agents, desperate for funds, sold salvation aggressively across Europe, arguing that payment guaranteed not only the forgiveness of your own sins, but also the release of your deceased relatives' souls from purgatory. It was a financial machine pushed into overdrive.
And this blatant, cynical commodification of grace was the final straw.
For Martin Luther, it was. It triggers his rebellion in 1517. The Medici Pope's greed helps fracture the unified church forever.
So the Reformation can, in many ways, be traced back to the moment the Medici counting house became the central nerve of the papacy.
The aggressive need for cash, driven by the Medici model of power and display, catalyzed a theological revolution that permanently split Western Christendom.
And the family's mutation didn't stop there. They continued to embed themselves into royal houses across Europe.
Absolutely. Their influence metastasized. Catherine de' Medici married King Henry II, France, becoming queen and reigning as regent for decades, deeply influencing French politics.
And by 1532, the Republic of Florence was formally dissolved.
Gone. Alessandro de' Medici, a descendant, was installed as the first Duke of Florence, turning the merchant family into hereditary rulers who lasted for 2 centuries.
The ultimate legacy, though, returns to that original system of transnational finance that Giovanni invented. That financial plumbing is the enduring blueprint.
It is the single most important concept. The Medici bank system created a new model for Power One based on the fluidity of global capital. Their gold florin became the most stable international standard currency of its age, the euro of its age, stabilizing trade and finance and ensuring the Medici were central to global commerce. This was the birth of the cross-border agent of capital.
And if we look at the world today, the power structure is still mirrored by these financial managers who operate seamlessly outside of national boundaries.
Yes, the contemporary transnational managerial classes. Think of the senior executives and technocrats who move between institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, major investment banks, and multinational corporations.
Just like the Medici agents controlling the Tolfa alum monopoly.
Exactly. These global financiers control the plumbing of the global economy, the flow of credit, currency, and strategic resources outside single-country jurisdictions.
They hold influence that dwarfs the local political arguments, regardless of who is elected in any one country.
Their decisions on credit ratings, monetary policy, or resource allocation can determine the economic fate of entire nations, independent of any democratic mandate. The constant lesson is that the system invented by the Medici remains fundamentally intact. Centralized finance, international capital flows, and the indispensable marriage of money and politics.
A circulation of elites driven by expertise in moving money, not by inherited title or local political loyalty.
Ultimately, the Renaissance wasn't just born from a sudden explosion of human genius. It was calculated and financed. Behind every magnificent facade, every political coup, and every cultural masterpiece stood the Medici counting house and their carefully managed ledger. They demonstrated conclusively that money, when properly leveraged and converted into soft power, could buy, shape, and rule history itself.
And that Medici blueprint, using finance and strategic debt to subvert the spirit of democracy, converting raw, unpopular wealth into cultural legitimacy, and establishing transnational control over the institutions that govern human affairs, never left us. The system they created, where influence is artfully wrapped in generosity and true power is measured in control of the underlying financial plumbing, defines the rules of the game today as much as it did in 15th century Florence.